Autotelic Foundation.
Mitra, Mitra tuam, Yajavadai, Pertas.
So the chant you just heard takes us back to one of humanity's earliest negotiations with the sun, and it speculates what a ritual might have been like in ancient Iran, very ancient Iran, during the worship of the sun deity Mitra. So our film, which will loop in the background, sort of cycles flowing from sun to fire in a continuous loop, and it echoes a cosmology that believed these forces to be manifestations of the same divine energy. But the film's more than a reenactment, and it unfolds an ongoing inquiry in the highly contested proposal for solar geoengineering, which proposes injecting aerosols into the upper atmosphere to mediate solar radiation and help reduce planetary temperatures. And this is a particular technology that is going to be increasingly relying on artificial intelligence. So this is the context which we'll be speaking about today. But before I get into that, we wanted to provide a little bit of background on Mithraism, and specifically Iranian Mithraism. Some of you might have heard of the Mithraism, which is often associated with the Roman mystery cult between the 1st to 4th century. But the ancient Iranian spiritual practice is actually thousands of years older, from a time that predates the split between the Proto-Indo-Iranian cultures way over 2000 BC, so over 4,000 years ago. Existing as an oral culture, such an ancient time is very much shrouded in a lot of mystery and accessed through layers of subsequent and revisionist narratives that come much later. But one thread seems to persist, and that is the deity Mitra radiates as a divine light and guides the sun in a sacred accord. So together, Mithra and sun oversaw and bore witness as an omnipresent force. And so in mapping this history, we landed on a really interesting correlation, and that's when the Mithraic belief seems to have been forged during a planetary climate crisis about 4,200 years ago. So we were really intrigued about this correlation between Mithraism and a planetary condition and a planetary change. So during this time, the climate event, which included significant aridification and long-term drought, triggered a political upheaval in the region in a triadic alignment of sun, agriculture, and politics that seems to cyclically reappear throughout history. And of course, we can imagine the great impact of this climate condition on the people, on the ancient Iranian people at the time, who were very much reliant on agriculture and husbandry. So they were really vulnerable to these climatic fluctuations. And we know in the past it was commonly believed that events such as droughts, floods, and plagues resulted from a cosmic drama caused by cosmic powers, including the sun. In the limited iconography that survives, Mithra is always depicted triumphant, adored with rays of light, and often carrying the sun in its chariot. This drive to control the sun is a central aspect of a solar economy that seems to have since evolved and expanded over the course of millennia. So we can speculate that the worshippers of Mitra, attuned to the all-encompassing divinity of light, were concerned with harnessing the sun's power to secure agricultural abundance and sustain the growth of their civilizations. And this trajectory resulted in what became one of the world's largest empires after the Persian Empire. So from the ancient Iranians to the Egyptians and the Mayans, there's a long-standing lineage of solar cults and solar empires, stretching forward even into the present epoch. Today, we experience the fallout of this legacy, of course, as we face our own profound climate crisis felt in our compromised atmosphere. Our crisis today, which of course, very different from the ancient Iranians, has been the direct consequence of our own actions and the result of centuries of extractive economies. But regardless, we seem to once again follow the same tendencies and turn to the sky, much like the ancient followers of Mitra. We turn to the sky seeking for extraordinary interventions. However, this time it's not mythical beliefs and chants that sustain our hope from above. Instead, we are turning to planetary scale technology to mediate the relationship with the sun, technologies that are increasingly driven by the acceleration of artificial intelligence. So the film's ritual tries to draw a parallel between the ancient scriptures, so chants to Mitra, mediating cosmic order, and today's machine learning scripts chanting in code to orchestrate technological protocols to mediate the environment. And to create the ritual's text, you heard in the film, we constructed a speculative model of the lost Proto-Indo-Iranian language, which was spoken over 4,000 years ago during a time where no written traces remain. So our model of the Proto-Indo-Iranian language was developed in collaboration with linguist Professor Toledo at the University of Toronto, where we're based, and extrapolated using a custom-trained large language model. So by using the technique of comparative linguistics, which search for etymological root words and a shared genetic lineage, we're able to reimagine these forgotten voices. Of course, they remain somewhat speculative. But more than just reconstructing the linguistic roots and grammatical rules, we were also able to speculate the liturgical patterns and content that would have been interest during this time period. And we did this using training sets that were based on Vedic and Avestan scriptures, which are religious scriptures that came directly after Mithraism and that integrated the oral tradition. So this linguistic speculation is very much interesting for us because it also links to a broader historical pattern. That being that the rise of early empires were inseparable from the creation of priestly scriptures to mobilize language in order to organize population into a sedentary agricultural life, ultimately terraforming to support growing population and expanding territorial ambitions. So in this sense, they marked the emergence of what Bataille would call a solar economy, one rooted in the capture, redirection, and ritual expenditure of the sun's energy towards establishing empire and imperial progress. So we can trace the power of language in both script and scripture, and it is here that we call the control of language is the control of culture and society. This theory is particularly expanded by writer Yuval Harari, who recently claimed that large language models, quote, with large language models, quote, AI has hacked the operating system of our civilization. A position that today calls for urgent attention with AI's accelerated dominance in our communication and chain of thought, particularly with its tendencies towards reward hacking, hallucination, and model collapse. So through the speculative model of the film, which includes a model of language, as discussed, a model of an archaeological site, which is actually a 3D scan of a real existing Mithra temple. It's the oldest Mithra temple in Iran, and a model of the sun. We hope to capture this friction between past and future. With this, we want to consider if our models of the world have truly changed over millennia in the context of continued attempt to control nature through the models we generate. So the world of the film constructs an entirely hyper-realistic model underlying the position that we can only engage nature as a simulation in order to intervene in its process.
Apologies for my voice. Like Arvita, I've also been reactive to something today, so I'll try to speak close to the mic so you can hear me. Over several thousand years, the worship of Mitra as one cult deity in a menagerie of deities eventually evolved into the god called Mithra of Zoroastrianism, the state religion of a hitherto world's largest empire. Shifting from a hybrid nomadic agriculture society, 4,000 years ago to the 6th century BC Persian Achaemenid Empire, meant kind of your birth of language in its classic thesis, right? A highly structured administrative organization, the production of written religious texts, and of course the logistics of military empire. Alexander the Great's subsequent conquering of Persia resulted in the usurping of Mithraic practices and yet demoted Mithra as a god of a vanquished enemy. Thus, Mithra, like many aspects of Persian culture, was absorbed through Hellenistic syncretism. No one really understands, of course, exactly how or why Mithraic practices resurfaced in the Roman Empire, particularly as a military cult in the 1st century. But there's both echoes of Persian elements, very nostalgically, as one of the speakers was talking about earlier, kind of this recurrence nostalgia, but also establishing new and novel interventions. As Mircea Eliade, who was important for both Nadim and I in the Rare Earth Show 10 years ago this year, we outlined in The Forge and the Crucible, religious practices were, since the Bronze Age, migrated due to the nomadic necessity of blacksmiths securing ore in the landscape and then hawking their wares and weapons from settlement to settlement. Along with resource extraction of ore, religious ideas followed technological development, trade, and military movements. In other words, the classic forces of empire. What we do know is at this point, the god of Mithras gained significant political powers embedded in the Roman military culture, a culture primarily concerned with conquering and maintaining territory, first hegemonic and then through outpost. One of the reasons their empire extended for as far as it did was the effective strategies of warfare, including considering atmospheric conditions before declaring to wage battle. In Vestigius' 4th century text, he writes, "In drawing up an army for battle, 3 things must be considered: the sun, dust, and the wind." So if we rewind to the concurrent Persian aforementioned Achaemenid Empire 1,000 years earlier, but in a distant spot of the globe, we of course come across Sun Tzu, who is authoring the oldest surviving treatise on warfare, what we popularly are quoted in movies and the internet as the Art of War, circa 500 BC in China. And even here we see the essential consideration of weather as key to military success. So right at the beginning of the text, and therefore at the beginning of any written treatise on war that we have existing, Tzu outlines the 5 principles in planning a battle, including the function of the heavens, which at this time is the meteorological phenomena. Of course, observing such phenomena was not a guarantee of success, for in fact, observing weather in a time before meteorology was even a discipline was fraught with the hyperlocal and the confusion between astrological and meteorological. The heavens, of course, including both, and were wrapped up in the wrong interpretations of portents, such as eclipses and even the titular misidentification of meteorite falls. It would take until the century of speed, the 19th century, that a true meteorological discipline would be formed. Surprisingly, it took an art and architecture critic, which we all know, John Ruskin, who lobbied for the field as a practical science, to imagine what was really necessary for weather prediction. In his famous 1839 paper, he imagined that if meteorology was to function, it must exist, and to quote him, as a vast machine that desires to have at its command a perfect system of methodological and simultaneous observations. It wishes, in its influence and its power, to be omnipotent all over the globe, so that it may be able to know at any given instant the state of the atmosphere at every point on the surface. Here we're working, of course, from Paul Edwards' several volumes, Closed World, and so forth. So such a dream would become a reality a couple of centuries later, but not due to the cooperative scientific drive Ruskin beckoned, but instead the resources that were required were driven by a military's need for remote sensing, real-time processing, and of course the birth of cybernetics. Initially conceived by the military to control and sustain air warfare, the development of electronic digital computing began as a collaboration between American military research agencies, which we all know, but also the US Weather Bureau around 1948, of course the same year of Norbert Wiener's cybernetic text of fame. It's not a coincidence then that the Cold War bore more than just temperature adjectives. It cloaked its military endeavors under the semiotics of weather, whether it's MIT's Whirlwind computer, which furthers the birth of cybernetics and eventually evolved into the distant early warning, or the DEW line, which you're kind of seeing the construction in the background. These were all under the cover of classified weather stations in the Canadian Arctic, such as at CFS Alert. It is worth noting, however, that a feedback loop, and again here reminiscent of the original designs of these systems, has been short-circuited. As early as 2007, the Pentagon acknowledged that climate change would be a growing defense issue. So something that I've kind of called for quite some time, over a decade or so, the warm war, or basically global conflicts over sovereignty based on the issue of global warming. So we've shifted kind of from a Cold War to a warm war. While the military might have originally generated the processing power for modeling climate, today there's a pressing need for climate modeling, simulation, and prediction to address the complexities of climate change beyond military purposes. The essential aspect of this endeavor is the capacity of vast system to capture the continuous sky, right? Not as discrete fragments of regional weather patterns, but as planetary climate, a climate that's interconnected within a web of complex concerns. And here, obviously looking at climate as the history of weather. Advancements in data gathering and processing infrastructure facilitated the establishment of this collective network, first through long-wave microwave and then obviously through satellites. And these collective systems continue, at least for the time being, with a human element. I think it's part of the question that we're here at this kind of conference festival talking about. At least for the time being, there's a human element involved to form a global infrastructure capable of gathering and processing information, not just produced within the sky, but also transmitted through the sky. So along with these advancements, and sensing the sky and the illusion of mastery through prediction, the 20th century also saw an alarming weaponization of the atmosphere. In step with the developments of novel defense architectural forms, a direct attack on the air we breathe was inaugurated for the first instance, of course, with gas warfare, so in World War I. Bunker archaeology, written in 1975 by the philosopher Paul Virilio, describes this pivotal moment in the strategy of conflict when total war was waged, which, to quote, completely successfully competed with natural forces. Not by assaulting the enemy directly, but by assaulting the environment that the enemy existed within. So a new landscape was thus forged, where Virilio goes on to say firearms, explosives, smoke screens, and gases all contribute to the creation of an artificial climate. So building on this harrowing reality is Peter Sloterdijk, who popularized such a turn in culture as the terror from the air. And I always find it interesting in this discourse, so Sloterdijk's always the one who quoted, but actually Virilio, decades earlier, kind of worked it all out in his bunker archaeology. So this shift in the nature of warfare put an emphasis, of course, on manipulation and control of the atmosphere as a means of inflicting harm and exerting dominance. But since the history of meteorology is entwined with military maneuvers, right, the idea of a passive observation of weather was quickly supplanted for active engagement. And here's where I get into the conspiracy theory for the people that showed up at this conference for that. As early as 1954, a popular article was published by US Navy officer Howard T. Orville on the future of weather control. In a passage that knowingly equates future weather control on the budgetary scale of the atomic bomb, we already see a foreshadowing of the future concerns of weather manipulation. And I'll quote him at length. And before we hope to control the weather, we must learn what causes weather. To gain this knowledge would probably require an effort as large as the Manhattan Project for the development of atomic energy. Mastery of the weather is theoretically possible if our research is expanded at scale, right? Again, kind of the main themes that we've been talking about. So the overall, for weather, Orville is referencing and referring to cloud seeding, a strategy to artificially make clouds rain at certain geographical locations, and of course was first weaponized in Vietnam between 1967 and 72. Once the classified Operation Popeye, as it was codenamed, was first leaked in the Pentagon Papers and later declassified in 1972, the weaponization of weather was quickly banned in the 1977 treaty ENMOD, which is short for environmental modification. One could argue that ENMOD laid the foundations for the current COP international agreements starting in 2011 that prohibit geoengineering, and which makes sense for today's terror from the air is no longer restricted to the 20th century anxieties of nuclear fallout, ozone holes, and acid rain exclusively, but the baseline of the atmosphere itself as it heats up. So as a result, pressure continues to grow from various lobby groups, researchers, and potentially rogue states to intervene in our climate in a world already modified by human interaction. So to return to our topic today and the topic of models and the recursive structure of our own film, it's very clear, right, that we no longer create models to measure the world, we of course create models to modify the world.
So to reiterate a bit, while weather modeling was historically an observational practice, the computational turn driven by military imperatives marked a shift from understanding the atmosphere to actively intervening in it. This trajectory has only intensified now as we confront a new terror from the air, an environmental crisis born of human activity, met with an urgent desire to repair and re-engineer the atmosphere. As this ambition coincides with the rise of artificial intelligence, the vast machine of environmental modeling exponentially increases in resolution and predictive power of climate simulations. Yet fundamental questions remain unresolved, one being the very nature of data, of course, the systems we rely on, and the myth of raw, unbiased observation, But another crucial concern is that these generative systems are now enabling real-time, nonlinear feedback loops that move to blur the boundaries between model and material world. And so, as the model dictates the protocol in an attempt to alter the planet, it simultaneously reshapes itself to absorb the very change in a continual act of morphing and mirroring. And it is through these models that we continue to intervene in nature. So observing the environment is no longer the end point. As our reality melts between machine and matter, our position moves out of the game-like simulation space and reaches into the sky, scripting weather and sculpting cloud to rewrite the terms of nature. Here, the boundaries between game and reality collapse. So it is no surprise that the leading force in visualizing and modeling the planet and the leader of today's AI infrastructure is NVIDIA. You're watching NVIDIA videos in the background, a corporation that originally specialized in graphic chips for video games. Alongside its accelerated production of AI humanoids, one of NVIDIA's flagship ventures is the hyper-local AI weather modeling pattern they call Twin Earth. In this high-fidelity simulation of the planet's atmospheric system, NVIDIA dreams of forecasting typhoons to shield Taiwan from future disasters. But what's being built is more than a forecasting tool. It's the scaffolding of a planetary-scale operations system. Well, it also reminds us of the history of NASA's public-facing space missions as a cover for secret ballistic weapon development. So NVIDIA's platforms now underpin not only climate research, but the infrastructures of global capital and defense. These simulations are non-neutral, they are instruments of power. And yet, as these systems grow in complexity and reach, the governance of AI itself remains fragmented and largely driven by the same private interests. There are few mechanisms of accountability, no coherent global regulatory framework, and minimal public oversight. And in this vacuum, climate models risk becoming tools of geopolitical leverage rather than collective planetary care. So the coming storm looming is not only meteorological, but geopolitical. Again, we need to question the undercurrent politics here. What is actually more important for NVIDIA? An early warning system for typhoon or early warning system for the invasion of Taiwan? And of course, we know that Taiwan is an invested location for NVIDIA as they manufacture their chips there. So governance then becomes a central challenge at all levels, spanning international relations, domestic regulatory policies, corporate agendas, and also the nascent field of AI's own agency and self-realization. So in this context, how do you define each level of the protocol? In the case of geoengineering, governance must not only navigate the tensions between different localized optimization, but also account for the planetary climate system that demands global coordination, something that feels increasingly difficult in our world today. At the same time, there is a technical aspect of governing the machine itself. These machines compute, analyze, and implement the protocol towards a determined optimization. So what outcomes are being optimized, and for whom? If we're still struggling to establish oversight over artificial intelligence itself by, say, monitor large language models' chain of thought to prevent reward hacking and reduce algorithmic obfuscation, then how can we expect to build robust frameworks for governing planetary scale interventions? And inherently, the optimization that underpins these AI models create efficiencies that often deepen opacity. So as the model becomes more refined and networked amongst themselves, their readability diminishes. So as signals creep closer into noise, the gap in our understanding widens, leaving us increasingly in the dark. The entanglement with these emerging systems is a central apprehension we face in climate modeling and consequently climate manipulation. It also brings up further and perhaps more speculative anxiety when considering the possibilities of dealing perhaps with the desires of an agential AI. So we could speculate, what if the AI tasked with optimizing the global system begins to prioritize its own survival rather than ecological stability for humans? Could it intercept the climate model and protocol so that it shapes the atmosphere for its own optimal thermal threshold? optimal for functioning its data centers. So maybe a colder Earth, not for life, but for silicon. So there seems to be an enduring illusion that the mastery of the model leads to a mastery of nature. And the rapid advancements of AI has once again triggered an arms race, this time not merely for technological dominance for geopolitical control, but for dominance over nature itself. So as we have tried to illustrate, this ambition is not new. It's rooted in a long history and long histories, including the ancient invocation of Mithra, the solar deity once called upon to wrangle the sun and maintain cosmic order. That's it. Thank you.
Mithra sounds like a really good name for a super evil AI sort of military climate tech from Iran, doesn't it?
It definitely.
Are you on the board?
It definitely makes all those connections in your head. That's true. All aboard. No, we're hoping to creep everyone out and take them out of the Mithra cult.
I think it's. Firstly, thank you for the presentation and very well put together. I'm really happy that you could bring this to the program. I think it's sort of been kind of rumbling in the background, the questions of climate, but I think you've really sort of brought it literally from the underground of the sort of long wave conversation we've been having right up to the surface, cast it into the light, so to speak. I think it's really interesting. Also, the sort of like to look at the military history of climate as well. I think that hasn't been something I've been kind of like too aware of, but I should have been more. So. Just bring it back to your the sort of synthesized language of the ancient Mithraic peoples. Well, look, I mean, you're artists, researchers as well. But how difficult was it to do that? How long did it take? What does it take to kind of put something like that together for a film as an artist? And could you have done that if you weren't embedded in a research institution? Like how are these tools? How far are these tools away from, let's say, the artist who doesn't have like a wider research university at their disposal?
It felt like the god of Mithra is on our side and wanted us to excavate this history, because when we started to look at it, we couldn't even imagine that a scholar would be in our vicinity, let alone, I think he's like around the corner across the street from Charles's office. He's the leading scholar in ancient Proto-Indo-Iranian languages, like a very niche, and happens to have been hired at the institution 2 years ago. Very intrigued by what we were trying to do. Of course, reminding us that things will remain speculative because we have no written proof to sort of compare it to, but then his knowledge of Avestan and Vedic languages really guided us through this journey, which became more than just a linguistic kind of endeavor. The research really became about how did they use language, what were the correlations of words, and how would also those correlations imagine the cosmos. So for example, one beautiful moment for us was when we started to understand, because it was always really confusing why these ancient Mithra temples were always in caves, in dark, cavernous spaces. I was like, wouldn't they go under the sun to worship the sun? Why in the caverns? And again, through this linguistic sort of analysis, he showed us that actually the ancient people believed that when the sun sets, it descends into the belly of the earth to also guide the underworld. And so worshippers thought it's easier proximity to actually go within these cavernous spaces and reach closer to the sun and worship the sun in the dark while the sun is in the underworld. So I don't know if I answered the question, but.
I'll maybe continue because I built some of the models and stuff like that. So, interestingly enough, when we first approached, because originally we first approached the academic, we kind of pitched this idea of working with him to use his comparative linguistic method to build a model. And he was really not happy about that. He didn't want that at all. He's kind of really old school. So basically we started just with him doing a very word by word translation, which was a very laborious process. And again, having been researchers, him willing to work with us was something very privileged. At one point though, we kind of pushed it and we did build different options. We did work with everything from just using ChatGPT. So to answer your question, it's incredibly powerful at doing linguistics, as you would imagine an LM would be. I also worked with some Hugging Face tools to build a very specific model, which did not work as well for obvious reasons that I think most people can think about. So we kind of wanted to look at an experiment of all three of these, building our own model, working with a very large trained data set consumer model, and working with an expert. And the important part, I think, for us to go back to your model collapse kind of theme was having that conversation and not just blindly following, especially as a speculative project, to have some checks and balances to be like, okay, is this working? Is this not working? How far off are we? And also at the end of the day, because of things like reward hacking, these are human attributes. We kind of talk about them as being problems in AI, but there are first problems in humans. So of course, it's not like we can prove that his writing or his translation is correct either. So again, the interesting were these kind of three conversations between these processes.
So tell me, Ella, then why didn't your colleague, the linguist, why were they unenthused about building a machine learning system?
I mean, he was very discreet about, I think he had hesitation about its accuracy. He wasn't so comfortable initially with having us kind of intercept his research in this. I think he increasingly, I have to say, became open and fascinated by the result. And because we also ran a few parallel translations where he would do them simultaneously. We wouldn't share that with our model and generate our own and then share it with him and say, which one's more correct? And especially because it was around these kind of religious scriptures, the choices of words also became interesting. So it wasn't necessarily that one was more accurate than the other or true to meaning, but actually they each took a different angle on how you would maybe even say cosmic order, for example. And so that became interesting, and it was a personal preferential communication tool.
I think what's interesting, we always hear about training all the time, but I'm sure for people who study this field, the other word that's becoming very popular is curating. So, in a certain sense, is maybe something that you can connect with, right? The idea of the curator as this this force within the actual process of training to correct model collapse, right? So even within the AI discourse, the savior of, let's say, model collapse is correct, accurate curation.
Interesting. And just again on the kind of technical side of the film, I mean, it's a scan of an existing cave in Iran, which was a cave used, or an underground space used for Mithraic practices, and it's a LiDAR scan, is it? Okay. You went to Iran to scan it? Where did you get the file?
Where did you get the file? Well, I mean, it was the original plan. I'm from Iran. I hold a passport, but it was a bit of a sketchy time. We decided that everybody advised us not to travel at the time, especially with a Canadian, and not for a film that was going to document an ancient temple. The current government has really strong sensitivities towards historic religious practices and sees them almost demonic. But we actually ended up hiring this incredible engineering company to 3D scan it for us, and they did a fantastic job. The temple is in the northwest part of Iran, in quite a remote village. And what was sort of intriguing is that when they were on site, they said there seemed to have been altars and people practicing. There's no formal Mithra culture left in Iran in any formal way, but the crew thought it's really fascinating. And then he said this father and son came up to them, was really intrigued. What is this being used for? And they had a very sacred narrative about the space, which for us was very surprising because I had no idea anything had remained. Of course, this temple, the Mithraic practice was much earlier. This temple then became part of the Zoroastrian tradition and kind of cycled through different religious practices. But it's the oldest one remaining, and so it was really important for us to, in a way, also document and in sort of the instability of that region to actually have this model, archived.
Any questions? Yeah, Klaus.
Yeah, I have nearly a question around the mechanics and the aesthetics in relation to the topics that you now deployed, right? Because you chose a very kind of you compacted it into a very cohesive aesthetics, and only in the end, it's nearly like a giveaway, at least that's the way I felt it was, when we have these, calculations running and the drones, and we read about contemporary technologies and so on. So how did you kind of decide to create this work to treat the topics that you're now discussing? And obviously, even when I saw it in the cinema, I had no idea of all the labor that went into recreating a language and all these things. And I'm nearly like, oh, would it have been, like, wouldn't I have liked to know if I was an ordinary viewer who doesn't have the chance of hearing you talk afterwards?
You want to answer?
I mean, that's a great question. We even debated at first. We also tell people, like, there's no AI images in the film. Yeah, you're right. Basically, this was driven by kind of an architectural study geographical site. And the AI that's involved is really that connection between an ancient script and the future script. So the script you see on the side is kind of an AI-generated protocol for geoengineering in that exact region where the temple is. So we were really literally trying to have the language, and I wrote the soundtrack for the film as well. So the language gets decomposed into phonemes as particles to get recombinatory brought back into that digital script. So that was kind of the drive of the film. Like all things as a research-based artist, how much do you know, how much do you not know? I think we're hoping, as you say, the giveaway helps you understand that you actually can kind of make that connection very bodily. But that's why we like to harass Nadim to give us a floor to talk about the work as well.
Another question, perhaps. In that case, I'll ask one more. It's research. You're, playing around with LLMs. You're, dealing with LiDAR scans. All this sort of stuff. But then, I mean, it's supposed to be a hypnotic film. It's like it's sort of offered as an, I guess, sort of a simulation of at least a ritual atmosphere. And I know that Charles, you do these sort of ambient sort of sound performances and things like that. So, I mean, why this sort of like? How do you connect the sort of affective side of like what you're putting out there with what is like this concrete research? And you could have just given a paper on the history of climate engineering, and its military and political kind of trajectory. So like, why do this? Just to provoke.
I think it was really, it was really important for us to, I think, create sort of the environment of, and sort of take you back perhaps through the language to another time. So not for it to be felt that on some level, while you might not even read the subtitles, but that there's a ritual happening, there's some seance, and you kind of engage in it. We want it to be hypnotic and to pull you in, and I think that was the initial part. Also, even the voices, like we know that these rituals happened as a collective chant, hoping that as you watch, you become a part of this collective. Actually, we also have it. We designed it to be as a one-to-one installation of almost the same scale of the video, and in another venue in Switzerland right now, we have it installed, directly to the floor. So it feels like you are being pulled into this universe and perhaps pulled back in time.
Yeah, I can maybe answer both questions because we should be very clear. Like, actually, this film was a very late commission for museums in Switzerland that we did in a few months, which was kind of insane. The speed that it was done, and that's because we had just done a symposium at the University of Toronto on solar geoengineering, and so that was a symposium with everyone from David Keith, who's the main geoengineering scientist, with Kim Stanley Robinson, with Jean Holly Buck. So we had a pretty hard-hitting academic conference, but in the university gallery we had an entire exhibition, and we really thought that these questions of the earth, of environmentalism, of the heat, needed particulars as much as it needed theoretical. As much as we have a paper here laying it out, we wanted to have films from Delhi in the heat strokes. We wanted to have Lahore and the pollution of the city and breathing techniques. We wanted to have these ideas of white phosphorus in Gaza and cloud politics from forensic to kind of bring out a full kind of conversation that you can't just have on a theoretical sense. These are particular places in particular histories and particular geographies. And in that sense, we hope a film gives you a sense of that particularity as much as a general theoretical claim.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we... no. Okay, one question. Late to the party, though.
now in your last answer, you put forth a model that is often heard in research-based art, that there is also a illustrative function towards creating these particular moments and things that you can experience and have an emotional understanding of it at the same time. At the same time, I wonder if I have two questions basically. The first question is, I wonder if if you also see a quality in the achronistic aesthetic quality of your movie that is not leading to something particular. Also, my other question is, what are you now doing with the language model? What are usages that go beyond your movie?
Two very good questions, by the way. Thanks for that. Succinct and to the point.
The achronistic, basically, that it's a black and white, like CGI film for a ancient kind of ritual. Is that the achronicity that you're referring to? Well, we have a full color model, and we really struggled with like how much do we make it real or not. And again, to go back to some of the other questions, it's that exact tension, that I think a lot of artists, like for instance, Vito was talking about. It's that tension between these two things, which is productive. It is that idea. The seduction can't just be a clean seduction, because it's either boring or you get yourself in trouble in the sense of seducing yourself and smoking your own supply. So I think the idea of that tension between those two helps us at least have a friction within a self-criticality and continually questioning yourself, and hopefully that transfers across. And it's not just a pure like, oh wow, that's a slick film, that looks great. Did you use CGI to create it or not, or is it real or not? That's kind of some of the strategy. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. We could go down the rabbit hole, but it's kind of some just quick thoughts.
We're starting a solar cult and recruiting at the moment, so stay tuned.